Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV, and in fact, the first show of the week. But we've got others coming up, including one on Sunday this week with a panel discussion with John McManus, Jack Bauscher, and Robert Lyman about Burma. But in today's show, we look at aircraft carriers in World War II with Bruce M. Petty. Bruce served aboard the USS Yorktown and brings his wealth of knowledge to the channel. His website, Voices from the Pacific, is in the links below. I'll bring him in now. It's evening where he is, afternoon, morning where I am. Good evening, Bruce. How are you today?
Well, alive and well, still breathing in spite of my advanced age.
Still breathing. So we were just chatting before we went live there. The thing about aircraft carriers is that all nations were using them for quite considerable time. They began using them for 20s, 30s, 40s, and they're still using today. So, of course, developments changed, doctrine changed, ideas changed, classes, sizes, wooden decks, armored decks. Is it a subject that you feel people need to be reminded sometimes of kind of the basics? It's that they get into the tactics that they use, but sometimes just starting from the scratch is kind of a good thing. Do you think that?
Well, I don't know if I'd use those exact words, but I guess I'd have to back up and say being an old carrier sailor and having served on an Essex class aircraft carrier, the USS Yorktown during the Vietnam War, even though at the time I wasn't sure I'd even survive my tour of duty there because there were so many different ways of getting killed on the flight deck of an aircraft carrier. You don't have to be in an airplane, but being on the deck is a pretty dangerous place. I mean, a resting deer can snap and they'll whip around, chop off legs, chop people in half. I've actually met a guy who got hit by a busted arresting gear when I was visiting the USS Midway some years ago with my daughter, and he actually survived being hit. But having survived, I've never lost my fascination with the whole process of launching and recovering aircraft at sea. So over the years, I've done a lot of reading, investigating, and some writing on the subject. So, and this is a PowerPoint presentation we're going to look at that I give in various venues. And I'm constantly researching and updating what I think I know about the subject. So it's like a lot of my lectures, it's seldom that I give the same exact lecture every time because I'm always going back and seeing what else I can find, or maybe something new will pop up and change my whole perspective on certain aspects of carrier warfare. But if we can get into the first slide, and I like to use this slide as an opener because this is a British aircraft carrier, probably pre-World War II, because if you see their biplanes on there. And the reason I like to start off with this is because naval aviation, as we knew it during during World War II, even today, basically the Royal Navy, they pioneered naval aviation as we know it. And we can move on to the next slide. And even though the Royal Navy pioneered naval aviation as we know it, the first person to actually land a plane on a ship was an American. And the ship wasn't even underway. It was an old USS Pennsylvania. This is like pre-World War I. You can see the four stacks there. It was coal-fired. It was later renamed the Pittsburgh. Not a very good picture, but if you move to the next slide, and the first person to actually land an aircraft on a ship was Eugene Ely. He was an American. This was in 1911. And what you're looking at, the picture's not that big, but this is the stern of Pennsylvania. What they did is they put down a wooden deck back there, and then they took some hemp rope and tied 50-pound sandbags to either end. And then there was two rails running down the middle that would raise the ropes off the deck, and he had a tail hook. Okay, so basically he came and landed on the stern of Pennsylvania. His tail hook caught one of the ropes. He came to a nice safe stop. And if you look at the photo on the right, you can see Eugene Ely there. And of course, he had to not only did he have to make his own flight deck, he had to make his own equipment. They didn't have Mae West in 1911. If you look closely, he's got a couple of bicycle inner tubes strapped around his waist and a soft football helmet of the day in case he did crash. That was supposed to protect him. Now, he was also the first person to take off from a ship, but this Pennsylvania, I think, was on the East Coast, and then later on the West Coast in San Francisco Bay, he launched himself off the bow of another ship. He almost didn't make it. His prop actually hit the water after he got off the ship and managed to make a landing on shore. But like a lot of early pioneers in aviation, he did not die of old age. He died in an aircraft accident later on. We can move to the next slide. And like I said, the Royal Navy, the British, they pioneered carrier aviation between 1914 and 1918 during the Great War. The photo on the graph on the left there is HMS Argus. That was 1918. That's after a lot of experimentation on how to launch and recover aircraft at sea. Originally, they took amphibious flying boats, and the ship would have to stop. They'd lower the plane into the water. It would take off, and then when they recovered, they had to stop the ship and hoist it back aboard. Well, in a combat situation, that doesn't work very well. But you can see on the right there, that is USS Langley. That was the first American carrier. It was experimental type. It was built on the hull of a collier. That's in the days when the fleet was fueled by coal. And if they didn't have coaling stops along the way, they had to have these ships that would carry coal with them. And they had to wait for calm seas, though, to transfer the coal from the collier over to the other ships. But they just sliced off the superstructure and put down a wooden flight deck, and that was America's first aircraft carrier. Now, if we can go to the next slide, please. And this is HMS Furious. It went through all sorts of modifications. The photo on the left, it took a while before the Royal Navy realized that if they were going to have a suitable aircraft carrier, they're going to have to do something about the superstructure. They couldn't leave it in the middle of the ship. So this was an attempt at recovering an aircraft at sea on Furious. Basically, they just put up a barrier, and it was a controlled crash landing. But once they brought it aboard, how do you get it off again? So eventually, they kind of concluded that you're going to have to move the superstructure, and carriers after that decided on the starboard side for putting up the superstructure. So you can see on the photo on the right, that's a later version of HMS Furious. Now we can go on to the next slide. And one of the early pioneers in the Royal Navy was Squadron Commander Edwin Dunning. Now this is before they finally concluded that if you wanted, you had to move the superstructure out of the middle of the ship. You wanted a contiguous flight deck, so you could land and launch planes without having this obstruction in the middle of the ship. But before that, Denning trialed the idea of the ship was moving, let's say it was going at 15 knots into the wind, and he would come up on the port side doing, let's say, 18 knots. So he's slowly coming up to the bow of the ship. And once he got over the bow, he would bank to the right, cut the engine, drop the deck, and all these gentlemen in their suits with their ties would run out and grab it and hold it down before it blew over. So he tried that a couple times. It worked, but then on the last attempt, something went wrong. Instead of landing on the deck, he ended up in the water and drowned. So we can go to the next slide. So this is HMS Hermes. This is the first purpose-built carrier, again, built by the Royal Navy. For whatever reason, they felt once they had the contiguous deck idea down, it had to follow the contours of the hull. So they weren't making maximum use of the flight deck at that stage. We can go on to the next slide.
Just a quick question for you, Bruce. And when we talk about land-based bombers and the strategic bombing, back in the 20s and the 30s, it's like the concept of what they could be doing was ahead of where the technology was. And then later on, aircraft kind of caught up with the ideas. In terms of carrier development, was the tail wagging the dog, or were they thinking long term about what aircraft carriers could be used for in the future, and then the aircraft catching up with it? Or were they kind of going with what the aircraft can do first? Or is that, how would you kind of describe what's going on in terms of long-term vision at this period?
Well, I think with any new type of technology, a lot of people have some ideas and they say, well, let's try this. If it works, fine. If it doesn't, let's try something else. If we have to, let's just start all over again until we get it right. I think it really was a process because, and I'm going to give you towards the end of the lecture an idea of people in the military who were thinking ahead. Okay. Okay. We've got this new technology. How can we best use it? Well, given the limitations of this technology as it exists now, this is as far as we can go. But then there are other people. Well, let's improve the engine so that they can fly faster and higher. Let's go from wood and fabric to aluminum frames, aluminum skins, stuff like that. It's an ongoing process. So it's not just this thing of, well, here we've got an aircraft, let's put them on ships and let's launch them. It was an evolutionary process like anything that's new. Now, I want to bring these up because this is the Sopwith Cuckoo and the Fairley Swordfish. These were torpedo bombers. They look like something left over from World War I, but the Fairley Swordfish was used by the Royal Navy right up until 1944. They were eventually being replaced by more modern aircraft. A lot of it was of American construct. But the Fairley Swordfish, one of those, planted a torpedo into the Bismarck, slowing it down so that the Royal Navy surface fleet could go in and finish it off. The Swordfish torpedo bombers, like you see there on the right, they were also involved in sinking part of the Italian fleet at Taranto in the Mediterranean during World War II. So even though they looked like something from the previous war, they proved to be of some value during the early years of World War II as well. So we can move on. And this is the IGN Hosho. This is Japanese first aircraft carrier. And I'm going to mention the Sempill mission too as part of this. But see, the Japanese were an ally in World War I. They had signed a supposedly secret agreement with the British in 1902 because the British had contingency plans for possible war with either Germany or Russia somewhere in the near future. And they realized that if they had an all-out war with one or both of them in Europe, they would not have the assets necessary to protect some of their colonial assets in the East, such as Hong Kong, India, and some other places. So they had this agreement with the Japanese that if they went to war with either Germany or Russia, then they would protect British assets in that part of the world. So being an ally, after World War II, the Japanese Navy said, well, you know, we want to keep up with the rest of the world in terms of naval aviation. So British aircraft industry, after the war, they didn't have any business. And they thought, well, maybe we should go over there and help the Japanese. So basically, Hosho was designed by British naval architects. And they also sent over a mission. It was led by Lord William Forbes Sempill, an individual. He's a Scotsman from Aberdeenshire. I happen to be distantly related to him. But he had broken a number of aviation flying records. He was a well-respected, a well-renowned aviator. And so he put together this mission, and they went over to help the Japanese learn how to fly amphibious aircraft. They set up some schools. They sent over a number of British-built aircraft, hoping they could sell them to the Japanese. Well, the Japanese bought a couple of them, and then they just copied them. So they didn't make a lot of money off it. The Admiralty was not too keen on the Sempill mission. They didn't want to do it, so it's kind of an unofficial mission. Matter of fact, the first person to take off and land on Hosho wasn't even Japanese. It was a British pilot by the name of Jordan, I think his last name was. But the Sempill mission was only supposed to last 18 months, but it actually lasted much longer. And when I was in the UK before COVID, I was there with my children, and we were up in Scotland. I wanted to show them some of our ancestral castles up there, Braemar, Midmar, and Kildrummy. And Kildrummy is not too far from the castle of William Forbes Sempill, Carrigaval Castle. Matter of fact, they have a little museum there at Kildrum. And I was talking to the historian. He says, you got to go down to Cargill Castle because there's a fellow there by the name of Sempill, and he's got these medals that were presented to him by the Japanese military. I said, well, I know the name Sempill because I talk about him in my lecture about aircraft carriers. So we went down there. Then I found out it was at the Royal Navy Air Base, and they have a museum and archives not too far from London. Lyleton, is that where it is? You're British.
Possibly. Yeovil. I thought it was Yeovilton. No. Maybe.
What was it called?
Is there not one in Yeovil?
Oh, maybe. But anyway, so I went out there and I made arrangements, and I went through their archives, and I got all this information about the Sempill mission. And I contacted my editor at Naval History magazine at the time. I said, have you ever heard of the Sempill mission? He says, not only have I not heard of it, I've checked our archives. Nothing has ever been written about it here. So I said, well, guess what? I'm going to write something for you. So I did, and then it was published in Naval History magazine, and the article can be found on my website. We can go on to the next slide. But here's William Forbes Sempill on the left, but there's also Frederick Rutland. Now, William Forbes Sempill, by the time World War II, he was an admiral. He was part of Churchill's inner circle. But MI5 or MI6, I think it was, they were following Sempill ever since the Sempill mission because he continued to work for the Japanese and supplying them with some information that they requested. Some of it was considered top secret. And they was even warned him. They said, we know you're doing this, and you better stop it. But he didn't. The Japanese were paying for it. Now, Frederick Rutland, he was a commoner. And he started off, in the ranks before World War I, and worked his way up. Got involved in the early days of naval aviation. He was in the air during the Battle of Jutland, and he had retired after World War I. And before he retired, though, he wrote a paper on what he thought an aircraft carrier should be. It should be so much length, so wide. Should be able to take aboard and launch aircraft in a combat situation. Basically, he had described the future aircraft carrier as we know it today, at least in its basic terms. But now he continued. He went over there separate from the Sempill mission and worked with Mitsubishi, and he continued to work for the Japanese too. Matter of fact, they were setting up dummy businesses for him on the west coast of the U.S. in the 1930s. And then when the Japanese went to war, he was supposed to continue supplying them with some valuable intelligence. But the FBI were following him. And as soon as the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, they arrested him, sent him back to England, and he spent the rest of the war in prison.
Yeah.
When he finally got out in 1949, he thought he could maybe save his reputation, but it didn't do any good. He ended up committing suicide in 1949, I think it was. Yeah,
we did a show on him. There's a book came out a year or so ago, so we did a show on Rutland. A fascinating.
Oh yeah, that was Beverly Hills Spy by what's the name? Ron Drabkin. He's an American. He lives in Japan. Yeah. Matter of fact, he said he read my article and took it a step further, and the end product was his book. I actually asked him if he was interested in doing a follow-up book about Sempill, because no book that I know of has been written about him. I wrote about him in a magazine article, but that's it. But we can move on. And this is Admiral Joseph Reeves. He's considered the father of carrier aviation, at least as far as the United States Navy is concerned. And he started off his career as a black shoe. When he went through Annapolis, they were still using kerosene lamps in their dorms. This is, I think, 1880s. And he was an up-and-comer. He was considered an expert on power plants, started going back to when the ships were coal-fired. And then when we converted over to bunker fuel, he adjusted to that. And it was late in his career when the Langley was commissioned and they started experimenting with naval aviation in the U.S. Navy. He got interested in that. Matter of fact, he was not the first or even the second skipper of the Langley, but later, when he took over, he did everything he could to see what they could accomplish with this. It was an experimental carrier. He would get down there with the deckhands. He wanted to see how many planes he could get on the flight deck and the hangar deck. And he experimented with how fast they could launch them, how fast they could recover them. So that's he made a lot of innovations that proved quite successful later on when we had bigger and better carriers. So that's why he's referred to as the father of carrier aviation in the U.S. Navy. Matter of fact, he retired in 1936. But even before Pearl Harbor, he was called back to active duty and put in charge of the Lend-Lease program for the U.S. Navy, and retired a second time in 1946. But we can move on. And this is USS Lexington. It was a battle cruiser hull, but I'm sure a lot of your viewers are familiar with the London and the Washington naval treaties. So they were trying to stave off another war. They didn't want to get into spending a lot of money, all these countries trying to outdo the other and how many battleships and cruisers and stuff. So they came to this agreement that there would only be so much. The British, the French, Italian, Japanese, American navies, they would just have so many battle cruisers, and the ones that were already built, some of them had to be scrapped. Some that were in the process of being built, they were scrapped. But somebody came up with the idea, so well, how about if we take a couple of these battle cruiser hulls and turn them into aircraft carriers, because this is all experimental at this time. And so it was agreed. So USS Lexington and Saratoga, these were built on battle cruiser hulls, and they turned out to be pretty good because they were almost 900 feet long. They had a good power plant. They had an armor belt around the hull, and they could hold quite a few planes. But if you look at the diagram on the bottom, you see they didn't really make the best use of the flight deck. It kind of goes in and out. They've got two aircraft elevators, but they're right in the middle of the deck. So if one of them gets damaged or gets stuck halfway down, you're out of business, right? So let's go on to the next slide. And the Ranger was the first U.S. aircraft carrier built from the hull up, and that was in 1934. And it proved to be not very good. It didn't have much of a power plant. And if you look closely towards the stern, the smokestacks are at the stern of the ship where the planes are landing. So during flight operations, they had to lower the stacks off to the side. Even the ready rooms were so small, they're really inadequate for debriefing pilots, before and after a mission. And I had the opportunity of doing the oral history interview of a Navy veteran pilot. He was a pilot going back to the 1930s, and he was a landing safety officer aboard Ranger. And he told me that for the longest time, pilots used lap belts. They didn't have shoulder harnesses. As a result, if they had a crash landing or they ended up in a drink, quite often the pilot would bang his head against the gun sight or the console, get knocked unconscious, and then go down with the plane. So sometime, I think, around Pearl Harbor, maybe before that, they came up with the idea of shoulder harnesses, and they saved a lot of lives that way. But the Ranger really didn't do much in the way of combat. I think it saw action during Operation Torch when the Allies landed in North Africa in November of 1942. And basically, what they had was U.S. Army Air Force planes, P-47s. And they had the planes there, and the pilots had never taken off or landed on an aircraft carrier. When they got to North Africa, they said, well, this is what you're going to do. You're going to take off and then land on shore. So they had to have a quickie lesson on how to take off from an aircraft carrier. But in terms of combat operations, I think you'd be hard-pressed to find Ranger anywhere, either in the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, or even in the Pacific. I think it was used more as a training vessel after that. We can go on to the next slide. And then after that, they kind of learned all the mistakes that they had made there with the Ranger. And so they came up with a new class, the USS Yorktown CV-5, which was commissioned in 1937, and then a year later, the Enterprise. And they sent off Admiral James Russell there during the construction because he wanted to make sure that all the mistakes they made on Ranger were not going to be made with these two new aircraft carriers. So he was dealing with unions and the shipbuilders and had a bit of a rough time of it. And of course, we know that Yorktown CV-5 was sunk at Coral Sea in May of 1942. Enterprise had been bombed and torpedoed, I don't know how many times, but managed to survive the war and was later scrapped at the end of World War II. Now we can move on.
Just a quick question for you about President Roosevelt, in that we all know that he was a great lover of the Navy and all things nautical. Was it good that he was in charge during this period? Because, you know, just making our aircraft carrier is a hell of a lot of money. So do you think his support was key?
That's a brilliant question, and I'm going to answer it shortly.
Cool. Oh well, I'm getting ahead of the game. Good.
That's all right, but that's a good question because I'll address that shortly. But anyway, so here's the U.S. Yorktown CV-5 built from the hull up. It was not as long as the Saratoga or the Lexington. It was just over 800 feet. And again, but we have three aircraft elevators: stern, midships, and forward. But again, the problem was if an elevator got stuck halfway up, halfway down, however you want to look at it, it's kind of hard to carry on air operations. And you can see too, the flight deck is not as wide as it could be. It's kind of goes in and out. That I never really understood. But we can go on to the next.
Just a quick question.
Right.
Peter O'Connell asked really early on about when did the starboard side become standard for having the island?
That I can't
why?
answer that question. I just remember that when they decided to move the superstructure off to one side, it was to the starboard side. But I understand too from my reading, this is going back ways, that the Japanese experimented with at least one carrier where they put the superstructure on the port side. It's a good question, but I can't answer it, unfortunately.
Okay, no problem. Moving on.
Yep. So here we are now, the Essex class aircraft carriers. This is after Yorktown and Enterprise, and they said, okay, well, there's a few things we don't like about this, so let's see if we can improve on it. So that's when the Essex class or the fast carriers came in. Okay, and you can see too that they're much more. The flight deck is much more rectangular. If you look, one of the plane elevators is moved to the port side. So if it's damaged or gets stuck, you can still carry on flight operations. So next slide. And so I'm just comparing. Here's Lexington on your left, CV2, and then USS Intrepid, CV11. Now, Intrepid is an Essex class. Just see how they made better use of the flight deck by just making it a little bit wider. Yeah. So we can move on. Okay, now to answer your question. Now, President Roosevelt, this is January 41, okay? This is 10 months before Pearl Harbor. They were already getting ready for war because the Japanese had already renounced the Washington and London Navy treaties, I think, in 1936, and they started building more ships. So we started building more ships. And in January 1941, the President of the United States said, disregard any plans for ship-to-carrier conversion that would take more than about 3 months. Because, these Essex-class fast carriers were great, but they were expensive to build, and they took a long time to build, and we didn't have that much time. We had to get ready, so we move on. Next slide. So here we go. They took an old cruiser hull, light cruiser hull, CL-59. They just whacked off the superstructure, laid down a wooden flight deck. I think it only has 2 airplane elevators. It's a little over 600 feet. You couldn't carry as many planes as you could on an Essex class carrier. I think the Essex class, you could get about 90 aircraft on those, depending on what time. But you have time, dive bombers, torpedo bombers, fighters. You maybe only get 25 or 30, but if you have 100 of them, you just take 25 or 30, multiply it by 100, you've got a lot of aircraft out there. Yeah. So move out to the next slide. And of course, when we only had about 6 aircraft carriers at the time of Pearl Harbor, we couldn't take any of them out, so we could train a whole new generation of carrier qualified pilots. So they went to the Great Lakes. They had these old side wheel steamers out there. One was the USS Sable, and there's another one, I can't remember the name, but basically they just knocked off the superstructure, laid down a flight deck. And if you look real closely there on the port side, it's still a side wheel steamer. That's a side wheel, just like Mark Twain days on the Mississippi, right? And so I interviewed a number of people. One of them was Alex Rashew, graduate of DePaul University, went through the civilian pilot training program back there when he was at university, and he qualified on one of these ships in the Great Lakes. I think he said you had to make 7 arrested landings and 7 takeoffs. If you survived those, then they sent you out to the fleet. So in the early days of the war, that's how we trained new carrier pilots on the Great Lakes. Next photo. And then we had escort carriers. Now, these are CVEs. Now, they took like cargo ships too, like USS Long Island there. See, that was a C3 cargo liner. And they just, again, sliced off the superstructure, laid down a wooden flight deck. And the reason they call them escort carriers because they were needed for the longest battle of World War II, which was the Battle of the Atlantic. Because you know how the U-boats in the early days, they were having a field day out there sinking merchant shipping. And we didn't have enough destroyers, destroyer escorts to escort them. And besides, aircraft proved more efficient because they could go out farther, they could fly up, they could see down. But we didn't have any aircraft until B-24s were later modified. Mm-hmm. So they built these little aircraft carriers. They're called escort carriers. So you can have planes out there along with the destroyers looking for these U-boats. And so once you got more aircraft out there, whether they're land-based or off these small escort carriers, it made it very difficult for the U-boats to carry out their mission after that. Matter of fact, I think it was the Long Island that took replacement aircraft out to the Marines and the Allies on Guadalcanal in the early part of the war in the Pacific. So we can move on. And also Henry Kaiser, you know, I'm not even sure he had a high school education, but he was quite an entrepreneur. Started off in photography, got involved in road building, then during the Depression, got involved in building dams such as Hoover Dam. And then the war started. He decided to get involved in that. He started building Liberty ships. He says, why not aircraft carriers? So up and down the West Coast, I think maybe even in the Gulf Coast of Texas, he built shipyards, and they started building these little, what they called Casablanca class escort carriers. People who sailed on them had other names for them, like Kaiser coffins and stuff like that, because they were quite vulnerable. They were small, they were thin-skinned, there was no armor belt. Matter of fact, one of the defects was they put bomb magazines right near the water line on the outside of the hull. Matter of fact, Gambier Bay, during the operations in the Gilbert Islands, the landings on Tarawa, it took a Japanese submarine, got in there and planted a torpedo in the side of Gambier Bay, right there where the bomb magazine was. It just blew it to smithereens, killed most of the people on the ship, including the captain of the ship and an admiral who was aboard. So I guess the people who sailed them knew what they were talking about when they called them Kaiser coffins. Oh, no, it was Liscombe Bay. Liscombe Bay was the one that was sunk off Tarawa. Gambier Bay was lost later in the Philippines. Yeah. Okay, next slide. And they also took some old oilers, ships that were to take bunker fuel out to resupply the ships in the fleet. They took a couple of them, the Sangamon class, and they turned those into aircraft carriers. They weren't even 600 feet long, but they could carry a lot of fuel too. But I interviewed a guy who was a photographer's mate on the Swanee, and it was one of the first ships to be hit by organized kamikazes. That was in the Philippines. Okay, I think HMAS Australia, the Australian cruiser, was one of the first to be hit by a kamikaze in the Philippines. Swanee took 2 kamikazes in 48 hours, and better than 50% of the crew were casualties because they had only the wooden flight deck. So if you got hit by a bomb or a kamikaze, you go right through the flight deck. It might explode in the hangar deck or even farther below. And if you have planes down there that are refueled, you've got bombs, torpedoes, depth charges, boy, you've got a problem. And I'll make more of this later on when I talk about when the British Pacific Fleet came out, because they had armored flight decks. I'll mention that as we go on. Next slide. And hurricane hulls, see? they were building aircraft carriers or taking hulls from different types of ships and putting flight decks on them. But it was pretty open. The bows and even the hangar deck, it was pretty open. So during the Philippine operation, when Admiral Halsey got caught in a super typhoon, with three destroyers turned turtle and went down with the loss of almost half. A lot of other ships were damaged. Aircraft were washed off the flight decks, and you can see in the upper left-hand corner there is a flight deck that was crumpled during that super typhoon. Now, these other two photos, the lower left and the lower right, that's my old ship Yorktown. You can see it's contiguous. The hull is contiguous with the flight deck. So and I went through 2 typhoons on Yorktown. And the photo on the right, the flight deck's about 40 feet off the water. I was up on the bridge and I took a photograph of it, went through 1 typhoon. You can see the waves actually breaking over the flight deck. But because the hull was contiguous with the flight deck, we didn't have to worry about being bent and destroyed like you see in the upper left-hand corner. So anyway, that's my old ship there, Yorktown. That was back in the 60s. Next slide. Now I'm talking about armored flight deck because I think the photograph on the left, I think it might have been indefatigable. This is when the British Pacific Fleet came out during the last year of the war, starting in late 44, to help the Americans bring the war to an end in the Pacific. Now, the late Prince Philip was the skipper of a destroyer with the British Pacific Fleet, HMS Whelp, I think it was. And in those days, all Allied ships had to have American personnel on there because signals and communication were different, and they had to have American personnel to help them with things like signals, communication, and other things, because the Royal Navy had their own way of doing things, but when you're part of the American fleet, you had to learn how to do things the American way. But anyway, this American officer was there with the future Prince Philip when a kamikaze hit one of these British aircraft carriers with the armored flight deck. And the guy says, oh no, look what happened. The casualties are going to be horrendous. And he says, no, you wait and see. So they watched, and they just took all the debris, shoved it off to the side of the ship. They had 8 killed, 48 wounded, but they didn't have to leave the scene. They didn't have to go back to Australia or Pearl Harbor for repairs. They just cleaned the mess off the deck and they were ready to go. But the photograph on the right, I think that was Bunker Hill. It got hit by a kamikaze. Over 500 casualties, as I recall. The wooden flight deck again. The plane went right through the flight deck, exploded in the hangar deck. Casualties were just horrendous, and the Bunker Hill was out of commission until they could go to a safe port and make repairs. And some of these damaged American aircraft carriers, they were so damaged, they never got back into the war. So we'll go to the next slide. Now, so I'm going to go back a bit. I'll go back to 1942. And I call this holding the line, because at that time we only had 6 aircraft carriers. Lexington was sunk at Coral Sea in May of 42. A month later, Yorktown CV5 was lost at Midway. I think it was September. USS Wasp was lost in the Eastern Solomons. A month later, Hornet was lost in Santa Cruz. There was a time when we had no aircraft carriers in the Pacific. We actually had to borrow a British Royal Navy aircraft carrier until we had new carriers come online and we could send them back out there. But that was 42. Then we get in 1943, we have the new Essex class carriers are coming online. So we'll go to the next slide. Here we are. So 1943, we have a new Essex class carriers coming online. We have a new Yorktown, a new Hornet. We have new light carriers, new escort carriers. So by the end of the war, even though the United States alone started off with only 6 carriers, we had well over 100 aircraft carriers of all types by the end of the war. Next slide. And this is USS Hornet CV-12. Now this is post World War II. Notice the canted flight deck.
Yep.
Okay. Before that, it was a contiguous flight deck. Yeah. And you had a resting gear, and then you had barriers that could go up in case a plane coming in if they missed all the arresting gear, there was a barrier to catch them. But there were cases where planes actually bounced over the carrier. And in those days, as the planes landed, they moved them up to the forward part of the ship and parked them until they can get them below. So there were instances where you had any number of planes parked on the forward part of the flight deck. And if a plane came in, missed the arresting gear, bounced over the barrier and crashed in, you had a real mess on your hands. Okay. So now this is another Royal Navy innovation. They'll say, well, why don't we just kind of make the stern sheet, we'll make the flight deck slightly angled off to the port side. That way, when a plane came in to land, if they missed all the arresting gear, they could gun their engines, go around and make another attempt. Now, that doesn't mean they did away with barriers altogether, because I remember we had a Skyhawk that had lost its tail hook one time. Oh, they didn't want to lose. They didn't want the pilot to bail out, and they didn't want to lose the plane, so they just put the barriers up. He came in, the barrier trapped him. The pilot was okay. The plane was okay. Of course, you had the landing signal officer back there on the stern, on the port side, waving his paddles, bringing in the plane. Mm-hmm. Now, if a LSO gave you a wave off, you better take that wave off. You don't ignore it and try to land anyway. Otherwise, you're in big trouble, because he's the god down there. And we did have an S2F. It was a prop plane. He was coming in. The LSO said, waved him off, told him to go around. He landed anyway. And he got the arresting gear, but then slid off the port side of the ship and hung upside down. So he and the crew had to jump in the water. Helicopters picked him up. And of course, the first thing he did when he got out of the helicopter, soaking wet, went up to see the captain. And he was going to get a good ass ringing. But anyway, we'll go to the next slide. Now, this is USS Midway, CV-41. It was commissioned right at the end of World War II, but didn't see any action. But this was the first U.S. built carrier that had an armored flight deck. And it did see action in Korea and Vietnam. Matter of fact, when I was going to boot camp, some guy got the wise idea that maybe we should go out and work on the flight deck of an aircraft carrier as part of our boot training. Basically, I think the idea was to scare the hell out of us, and they pretty well succeeded. Matter of fact, a friend of mine that I went to boot camp with put in for shore duty right after we got off the ship. Of course, I wasn't smart enough. I ended up doing just that, being on the flight deck for the next couple of years. I took my daughter out there some years ago when she was still at university. I thought I'd just take her. I said, well, this is the kind of life I had, and this is the kind of bunks we had to sleep in. And I thought we'd just go out for an hour or two. She spent most of the day there exploring that thing. I was thinking, well, maybe she's going to enlist in the Navy, but I was wrong. When she graduated from university, she ended up enlisting in the U.S. Army. So she's a captain in the U.S. Army now. We can go on to the next slide. And of course, now Chinese are building their own aircraft carriers. The one on the left was an old Soviet-era aircraft carrier. They managed to buy it from the Russians and studied it and took it apart. And then they started building their own aircraft carriers. They're building a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. And of course, their ambition is to really become a superpower, push the United States and allies as far east in the Pacific as they can. So I think and we're really moving a lot of our assets out to the Pacific now, because I think a lot of people in the military and the State Department, people I know, their biggest worry is not so much Putin's Russia. It's Xi's China.
Yeah.
So that's where our focus is now. So we can move on to the next slide. I'm getting pretty close to the end. Now, this is usually where I would end my lecture by asking the question, what is the future of the aircraft carrier? And my usual answer to that is, I don't know. I say, look, an aircraft carrier takes a long time to build. They're expensive to build. They're expensive to maintain. They're expensive to operate. Another way of looking at it is they're 5 square acres of target. How do you hide a nuclear aircraft carrier? We have 11 of them. Okay. And so that's how I kind of ended my lecture. But now we have the F-35. We have these vertical takeoff jets, the F-35. And then I don't know, it was earlier this, or maybe it was last year, I was reading through proceedings put out by the United States Naval Institute. And in the back of proceedings, just like in the back of Naval History magazine, there are book reviews. And here's this book by Commander Jeff Vandenagel, the United States Navy. And the title of his book is Questioning the Carrier. And I saw that. I said, I've got to read that. And now if you go to the next slide, this is how he opens up his book, the very first page. The U.S. Navy has the most powerful fleet in all naval history. The large nuclear-powered aircraft carrier is the most powerful surface warship in the fleet and in all naval history. The U.S. Navy should stop building them immediately.
It's quite a line, that. Yeah.
Wow. So, well, being a member of the United States Naval Institute, I didn't have too much trouble contacting him. So I wrote to him and I said, look, this is what I've been talking about. I've read your book. I said, that just blew my mind away. And so we've been exchanging emails. And in the book, he says, you know, if we're going to have aircraft carriers, they should be smaller, cheaper to build. We can build more of them. And he said, and he also said, look, we have these flat tops. They're not like nuclear carriers, but they'll have helicopters and Marines on board them. That's for, you know, amphibious landings and stuff like that. He said, we could take those and put vertical takeoff F-35s on there, and we could have a lot of them, and they could be dispersed. And the other thing is you know, you need weaponry that has a low, what was the term he used? Low radar silhouette, so they're harder to pick up. So I said, well, how about some wooden ships? I don't think you can make a wooden nuclear aircraft carrier, but I said during World War II, we had wooden ships. A lot of minesweepers were wood. And I also pointed out that, you know, in the last months of the war, when the Japanese were running out of aircraft to use as kamikazes, they took out some of these old wooden fabric planes they had in storage. And they turned out to be pretty good kamikazes because they're wooden fabric. Radar had a hard time picking them up. And he told me, I was flattered. He says, I had never thought of that. So, and this is anecdotal, what I'm going to present to you now, and then I should be done. But I was talking to somebody some years ago, and his wife is a graduate of the Naval Academy. And she told him, look, I'm going to disappear for 6 weeks. I'm going to a school to learn how to make ships electronically invisible. Now, I don't know how you do that. And I don't know if you can make a CVN electronically invisible. But then later, I was watching this French documentary on YouTube about this new class of frigates that the French Navy had put out. And they were, in the documentary, they were putting electronic decoys of their ships in the water. And the idea was that if an enemy submarine fired a homing torpedo at one of their frigates, they would go for all these decoys in the water until they went out the other side. So I sent that to him, but I don't think he speaks French, so he never got back to me about that. But so this is, of course, the farther away I get from World War II, you know, the less confident I am about what I'm saying. So, but I'm always picking up information, at least in my estimation. I don't care if you're a World War II historian. To me, it's just natural to think ahead in terms of national security issues, because a lot of what's going on today seems almost like a carbon copy of what was going on in the last century as we were preparing for war with Japan. Because right now we're preparing for war with China. There's no getting around it. Now, another thing I might add, though, since Jeff's book came out last year, the media, at least what I've been reading, is just full of articles questioning the future of the aircraft carrier. So anyway, last time I heard from Jeff, he's getting ready, or maybe he's already taking command of a nuclear submarine because he's a submariner. But he will watch this podcast. And if I misrepresented anything he has written or anything he's told me, I'm sure he will let me know. So unless there's any questions,
that's you, isn't it? Well, that's your last.
I throw that in there. That's telling me my lecture's over.
Okay, no worries. So, well, we have a couple of questions. Willie Robertson is asking, were the early arrestor systems hydraulic?
Oh, that's something. Yeah. Yeah, they were. I think the early arrest. Well, the early arrest there was 50-pound sandbags tied to hemp rope. But yeah, they had hydraulic systems. Then they had hydraulic catapults. Then steam catapults. Now the new CVNs, the Ford class. Now that reminds me, because in spite of what Jeff has written about getting rid of these CVNs, they are right now in the process of building 2 more simultaneously Ford class aircraft carriers. Now they're using what they call electromagnetic resting gear, electromagnetic catapults, and electromagnetic bomb elevators. But this is new technology, and they've had just one problem after another trying to figure these things out. Now, if you look at a Nimitz class aircraft carrier, it's huge, but the island structure has shrunk.
Right.
They've taken all of this technology and they've shrunk it down. I like to compare it to the first cell phones.
Yeah.
You almost had to have a caddy to carry it around for you because they were huge and you had to pull out an antenna. But now, because of they've shrunk a lot of the technology, they can operate these Ford class CVNs with fewer crew. Somewhere I've read recently between 500 and 900 fewer crew members are needed because a lot of the stuff are just self-sustaining. They don't constantly need to be tweaked and oiled and repaired. They're just long lasting. And these Ford class CVNs are supposed to last up to 50 years. And they're building 2 more.
Yeah, because
they looked out a lot of the bugs, but can we protect them?
Yeah.
Are there electronic means of preventing ICBMs with multiple warheads from finding these carriers? I would think that losing 1 CVN or more would be like a mini Pearl Harbor for us.
Yeah,
that's a huge investment in time, in terms of time and money, building these CVNs. And if we lose just one, or if we lost,
you had the question from Peter about any thoughts on how vulnerable the U.S. Navy Ford class CVNs are. Well, you've just been answering that, but that's the thing, is that as technology, I'm going to use a Star Wars analogy now, but the Death Star failed because of that port that they hadn't anticipated fighter aircraft. The rebels flying inside. With something as complicated and complex and vast as a modern carrier, the drone technology that we're moving more and more, we're seeing that in Ukraine so often, is that are they prepared to defend against something tiny and technologically kind of simple? I mean, drones are essentially very simple, aren't they? Whereas interballistic missiles are very complicated with all sorts of systems that can be detected. So it goes back to the kamikaze idea in World War II, isn't it? In that you've got a system set up for waves of aircraft flying, doing conventional things overhead, but you can't really prepare yourself against someone who's prepared to kind of just fly directly into an aircraft, into a carrier. So we'll see what happens with all these things: naval technology, aircraft bombing, strategic bombing, paratroopers, special forces. There's always these questions: how long will these things last?
That's right. As soon as we have a foolproof system, somebody finds a way of getting around it.
Yeah.
And can you imagine, here we are, we're spending multi-billion-dollar aircraft carriers, and then you got a $500 drone comes in and sinks it. I'm probably exaggerating. But see, World War II,
I think that's kind of it, isn't it? I mean, Ukraine is throwing, I mean, we're not going to go into a massive, great debate about Ukraine, but Ukraine is confirming what lots of, war experts say, and it's also debunking what lots of things say. It's changing the way people are understanding how wars will be fought in the future, because Ukraine is kind of bridging the old way of fighting wars with the new way of fighting wars, and it's terrifying to think what's going to happen in the future, really.
I would imagine that people who are actively involved in trying to keep us safe and present systems that will keep us safe, I wonder how many of them are having nervous breakdowns, because things are changing almost daily.
Yeah.
What we were like, let's look at World War II. It was land, sea, air, and below the surface of the sea with submarines, right? And now it's land, sea, air, it's space, it's cyberspace. I mean, multiple layers are involved in a possible future war, I would say.
Yeah. Well,
these are questions here.
These are conversations of the time, but it's been fantastic talking to you again, Bruce. So we'll look forward to scheduling another show. But in the meantime, folks, don't forget to check out Bruce's website. It's in the description below. And you'll see me again tomorrow and Friday. Tomorrow, we're looking at the logistics build-up for D-Day. And Friday, we're looking at the German preparations for the defending of Normandy with Neil. So we'll look forward to that. So thanks, everyone, for watching. I will see you all again tomorrow. This is Paul Woodadge for World War II TV saying enjoy the rest of your day. Cheers, everybody. Bye.